All right. So I'm just going to go through. I mentioned last time. Are there? Does everybody have a? Should be enough. It's still Pesach, so I thought we'd continue with some Pesach material. 16. You see, it's just one packet, page 16.
I don't think you got the right. It's not enough. Oh, there's some over there. You need to get this top square on it.
And I mentioned last time that the Haggadah follows a lot of the forms of the Talmud. So I thought we would look at some passages that really do follow the form of the Talmud. Some are taken from the Talmud, some aren't, but follow the same form. And we're going to begin with, I think, is really a great oddity of the Seder and a strange way of going about Magid. Magid is a storytelling section, and it's the heart of the Seder. It's the most important part of the Seder. And Magid means telling the story. And it's not that they don't tell the story, but they tell it in such a roundabout way that it's confusing. And I'll say that that this section of the Seder is one of the biggest victims to creative Haggadahs, because it's so difficult. The material is so difficult and seemingly sort of out of context that a lot of modern Seders just skip it, because there's not a place in the Magid section where they just tell the story. And the thing is that it would be easy to do, even if they didn't want to be storytellers themselves. You quote Exodus. You have some Moses goes to Pharaoh, and now of course one reason they can't do that is they can't have the word Moses in there, but that's their own choice. I know it's.
What's the reason they cannot have Moses?
Well, there's lots of reasons. It's not clear that nobody left notes like, here's why we don't have Moses. The thing I heard in Hebrew school is that we don't want to worship Moses. We don't know where Moses is buried. We take Moses out of the central role, so we understand that God is the central role. I think a couple of weeks ago I mentioned that by removing Moses and Aaron, by the way, and Miriam, and mostly Pharaoh, taking all the main characters out, you remove the essence of the story from the historical context. What you leave is the ideals, the ethics, the morals that flow from the story, and then you can apply those to your life. So the details don't matter. It's the essence that matters, the ethics, the ideals that matter. Anyway, so what happens is, the Haggadah starts the storytelling with a passage from Deuteronomy. So not Exodus, from Deuteronomy, and it analyzes that text in Deuteronomy. And the text in Deuteronomy is not from Passover at all, but it describes a Maser ritual. Now, we've studied some Maser a little bit, so you know what that means. The tithing. It's a tithing ritual. When you're done with your tithing in the harvest, when you live in the land of Israel. So in other words, we start the storytelling with a free people, Am Choshi, a free people living in the land of Israel, and they've finished the harvest. It's not Pesach. So they finished the harvest, and they've tithed, and they recite something. It's a ritual recitation, a ritual storytelling, and that's where the Haggadah starts. It takes that passage that you're supposed to say after tithing, and then it analyzes it. And that's Magid. That's most of Magid. So it's already a little difficult. We're going to study a bit of it. I will say what the effect, though, is a very layered storytelling, because this is what happens. You don't tell just the story straight out, like a mother telling the story to a kid. You quote from people that are telling the story at least 40 years later, but it's much more than that, because the Torah here is describing the Jewish people established and free, so it's well after the 40 years in the desert. So you have them telling the story. Then you have, that's one layer. Then you have the rabbis reading that maybe 1,000 years later. So that's another layer. And in their reading it, they're connecting it back to the original Exodus story. So that's a third layer, because you have the original Exodus story, but it only comes through interpretations of the rabbis as they're reading the section from Deuteronomy. That's the third layer. And the fourth layer, of course, is us reading it at our Seder and putting our own lives into it. So by choosing not the original story, which may get you stuck at the original story, they actually go ahead in time and tell not the story, but how the story is going to be recounted ahead. And then they take the original story, attach it to that story. So that's the third layer. That's the rabbis themselves recounting the story, and of course putting in their own experiences in. Because they do. By every interpretation is putting your own experience, your own spin on the story. And then there's also the sense that we today are reading it. And that's always the fourth layer. Okay. What I want to do, because I'm going to run out of time in a minute with all these explanations, I want to get to some text study, is you don't have it in front of you. You have sort of it. Look on page 16. Well, I'll read this first. And then I'll read the entire passage, not the entire passage, but the relevant passage in Deuteronomy. And then we'll have a little time to read some of their interpretations of that passage. Because again, the interpretations of that passage constitutes the heart of Magid. That's the storytelling. Not go down Moses, not Moses spoke to Pharaoh, but this section that I'm about to read. Okay, so we're on page 16 at the bottom. I'll read in Hebrew, but we have a good translation so you can follow. Say umad ma bikesh lavana arami lasot liYaakov avinu. Come and learn. So the Magid section is starting with come and learn what Laban, the Aramean, did to Jacob. So we don't start with Moses, we start with Jacob. Jacob, our patriarch. Shiparo lo gazar ela al ascharim. For Pharaoh only tried to kill the boys. Velavan bikesh la'akor et hakol. And Laban tried to uproot everything, to destroy everything. La'akor et hakol is a very interesting phrase. It's similar to what the Rasha does. The Rasha kafar ba'ikar. Yeah, the word ikar, la'akor, uprooting. You know, that Laban and the wicked son are involved in uprooting. And it doesn't mean physical murder. But they say here he's even worse. Laban, it's always confused me as a kid. By the way, I'll just tell you, as a kid, we didn't linger over these passages. We read them because my grandfather insisted. So we read everything. He couldn't leave anything out. But we davened it. You know, he would just chant it. So it added some mystique to the whole thing, but also to this sense of gobbledygook. Like, what is this? Why is Laban there? Who cares about Laban? This is about Pharaoh and Moses, and we're just chanting and we're not reading it. So it's only really later in life that I studied it and realized how brilliant it is. Every time you try to rewrite a classic, you know, or make a classic more popular, you know, you do that with some risk because you lose the essence of the classic. And the same thing happens to the prayer book too. So the prayer book and the Haggadah were written over a period of centuries. So when you try to rewrite something in our day, that's a work that was written over centuries, you're going to lose some of the wisdom, the accumulated wisdom of the centuries. So I didn't realize that as a kid because we were just zooming through it. Anyway, so here's Laban, and he's worse than Pharaoh. Shene'emar, as it says, Arami oved avi. And that's where we're going to start. It's a quote. An Aramean wanted to destroy my father. Now, of course, right away, there's a willful mistranslation of that phrase. That phrase seems to be, my father was a wandering Aramean, which would mean it refers actually to Jacob, not to Laban, or maybe even to Abraham. My father wandered, or Jacob wandered. But here, you can take the word wander, oved, and you could use that as to kill, like ibud is to get lost. Right? Try to make my father Avi get lost. It can mean that. It's clever. It's not literal, but it's clever. It's not ridiculous. So let me read you now the section from Deuteronomy, which is that's why they pick this, because it's later people recounting the story of the Jewish people, putting the Exodus front and center. I'm going to read a little bit. Anita Vamarta. So this is the ceremony. You're tithe. You set out the tithes for the priest, and you say, you don't have it. I'm just reading it to you. Arami oved avi. My father was a fugitive Aramean. But remember, that's not how the Haggadah reads it. This is the first act of interpretation. The first act of interpretation is that Laban, the Aramean, tried to kill my father. I'll just read it in English. He went down to Egypt with meager numbers and sojourned there. But there he became a great and very populous nation. The Egyptians dealt harshly with us and oppressed us. They imposed heavy labor upon us. We cried to the Lord, the God of our fathers, and the Lord heard our plea and saw our plight, our misery, and our oppression. The Lord freed us from Egypt by a mighty hand, by an outstretched arm and awesome power, and by signs and portents. He brought us to this place and gave us this land, a land flowing with milk and honey. Wherefore, I now bring the first fruits of the soil, which you, O Lord, has given me. Okay? That's not said on Pesach. Yet, you see, it's a recounting of the story. So that's how they choose to tell the story, by analyzing in a lot of detail what I just read right now. And that constitutes constitutes these several pages of the Haggadah. Okay, so you want to keep asking yourself why, since there's a much easier way to do it. And I mentioned one reason already. This allows a much more layered narrative. We have all these different levels of people that are going through the story and reading and understanding the story. I have a few other theories, which you'll see in my email today and also at services. But I want to read some of this. Okay, so what amuses me, in some ways saddens me, turn to page 17, is you'll notice that the Hebrew print is smaller here. Yeah. Almost, in a subtle way, the editor is encouraging you to slip it. To skip it. He's just saying, yeah, stuff. Because even the editor doesn't quite understand. Like, why is this here? even the editor of the Haggadah is. And the thing is, to me, it's obvious why it's here. It's this. They want this layered kind of storytelling, and they want to linger over these words. They feel like this is important. An important way to understand the story is to understand how people 100 years later understood it. They didn't want the immediacy of the actual telling, the actual story itself. They wanted to know how people would tell the story 100 years later, because that would be the model, for us, because we didn't go through it either. They want us. This is how people that didn't go through it told it, and that's the model for you. All right. So, and you'll see there's a lot of interesting stuff here. Okay, and it's very much in the style of, I would say, rabbinic style, not so much the Talmud a little bit, but also the Midrash. One of the important styles of the Midrash is that certain verses comment on other verses. Even if they don't appear to, we are going to make them comment on each other, and by comparing verses, you get a higher truth. So you'll see some examples. So page 17, there's that little one there, and we just repeat the verse. Arami oved avi. An Aramean tried to kill my father. Vayed Mitzrayma, went to Egypt. Vayagar sham b'bnei at, and they started there as not very many. Vayisham legoy gadol atzum varav, and they were all three words are important. They were a nation that was great, mighty, and populous, and there were a lot of them. Okay, all right. Now we're going to analyze these. Vayared Mitzrayma. All right, we're just analyzing that two-word phrase. They went down to Egypt. This is Jacob. Anus al pi hadibur. Compelled so by divine command. Okay? Pretty interesting commentary there. It's referring back to a prophecy that God makes to Abraham. Remember, God speaks to Abraham and says, none of the story of the Exodus should be a surprise to someone who's reading the Bible. Of course, it's not a surprise now, since we've read it a bunch of times. But if you're reading it for the first time, God says to Abraham, your people are going to go to Egypt. They're going to be enslaved. There's an issue with the chronology a little bit, because for Abraham it was some number of years, and then when he talks to Isaac, he gives a different number of years, and then if you do the chronology in Egypt, it's a different number of years. But the details are there. Your people are going to go down to Egypt. They're going to be strangers in a strange land, and it's going to happen. So when it says that Jacob went down to Egypt, compelled to do so by divine command, it doesn't mean so much that God says, hey, Jacob, you must go now and fulfill. Because you know why Jacob went to Egypt.
Famine. And his son was there.
Yeah, because his son was there, right? God approves of it, but there's not God telling him, okay, it's time now, Jacob. It's time for you guys to be slaves. But the rabbis are saying he really didn't have a choice. He was compelled. It's a very interesting sort of take on what life is like, really. Is your life fated to happen the way it happens because it was decreed and you're not really aware of it? Because that would be, Jacob wouldn't have put it that way. Yeah. Jacob wouldn't have said, I was forced. Jacob would say, I had free will. It was a logical decision. My son was living there. There's food there. But God didn't make me. But the God is saying that's how life works. Like you think you have free will, but in fact, there's a plan. Which is kind of a religious consciousness that I'm following a greater plan. So that's hinted at just in that short interpretation. Yeah.
Joseph was aware of that certainly when he went to his brothers.
Sure.
See, I think Joseph. We can talk about this more. Maybe, but I think Joseph was thinking about the dream that he had.
Yeah.
Of the sun and the moon and the stars bowing down to him, and that was for him that was destiny.
That's right.
I don't know where he was thinking of Abraham's story. I don't know. It doesn't say.
Because when he meets the brothers, he says, "This was meant to me. God wanted me to be here."
Yes, but he said, yes, but not to fulfill that particular prophecy. It's to save your life. Like it was to save your life. This actually says it was because this says it starts with that promise the promise to Abraham also calls it a promise. Interesting.
Right.
Michael.
I think when Jacob went to Egypt, he wasn't aware yet that his son was there. Didn't Joseph keep Benjamin and told the sons, "You bring your father here to get Benjamin"?
By the time Jacob goes, it's because he's shocked. He can't believe he's still alive.
A message is sent from Joseph to his father about the things he used to learn with his father. Breaking of the neck, as I remember.
Oh, that's the midrash.
And that's the one that tells him that this is his
This actually is Joseph. But even in the text itself, the brothers inform Jacob that Joseph is alive and we have to get down there. Okay, I'll keep going. But you can see just that little piece there opens up a really interesting sort of philosophical issue about free will versus destiny. And okay, Vayagar Sham. Okay, and they live there. Again, it's going to like as you know with the Talmud, a strong focus on a single word, which here is Vayagar. So Vayagar is an interesting word because it means, yes, well, first of all, it just means to live. Efa Tagar, where do you live? However, if you look, a more exact translation in the Bible is that you live there temporarily. Like that's lagur is to live temporarily because it's also the same root as stranger, a ger, which is a stranger. Okay, and now when Abraham, what you need to know, because this is also, and the Haggadah expects you to know the whole Bible by heart, and certainly these passages, but you may not. So I'll remind you that when God makes the prediction that the people are going to go to Egypt, God predicts 3 types of suffering that are going to happen. One is avodah, slaves. You'll be slaves. One is inui. So inui means suffering, physical suffering, because hard work doesn't necessarily imply it hurts. It could, if you have a terrible slave master, it could, but it could just mean hard work. So in addition to hard work, there's going to be physical suffering, and gior, meaning that you'll be a stranger. You'll feel like a stranger. So it's like alienation, feeling like a stranger in a strange land. Okay, so all that gar there is focused on. You can live there. Milamed, it teaches. That Jacob had no intention of lishtakev, of setting down roots, of living there permanently. Ela lagur sham, rather to live there temporarily. Shene amar. Okay, and this is now it quotes the actual story. Well, actually, it's the story of Joseph, because here now it's the brothers talking to Pharaoh. You remember that story where so Joseph introduces his family. It's an interesting story because Joseph introduces his brothers to Pharaoh and says to his brothers, okay, you can say whatever you want, but whatever you do, don't tell them that you're raising cattle because Egyptians don't like that, and it's not considered a very good job. It's considered a very low-class job in Egypt. Who knows why? So the first thing the brothers say is that we raise cattle. So it's an important, they want to show Joseph that you may be king here, but you're still our little brother. We're not necessarily listening to everything you say. We're going to establish ourselves however they want. Anyhow, so they say to Pharaoh, Vayomer al Pharaoh, Lagur ba'aretz banu. Okay, we only came here temporarily. Ki ein mireh litzon asher lavadecha. Because where we are, there's no grass to raise cattle. Sheep or cattle. Kikaveda ra be'aretz Canaan, because there's the drought is too heavy in the land of Canaan. V'ata yeshnu avadecha be'aretz Goshen. So we're here to live in Goshen. Okay. Bimtei ma'at. Okay, a small people. Kemoshe ne'amar. Okay, so now so we take that little phrase from Deuteronomy and reflect it back to the prime source. The actual source, the direct source, which is Exodus. B'shiv'im, this is B'shiv'im nefesh yardu avotecha mitzrayim. I'm sorry, this actually is quoting Deuteronomy. But it's also in the book of Exodus and it's in Genesis. They were only 70. And now God has made you, as in the promise to Abraham, as numerous as the stars in heaven. Of course, that would be several trillion. So we haven't quite made it to that yet. But history is still unfolding. So let's see.
A lot of people trying to keep us from getting there.
Yeah. All right. Next one. Really interesting also. Vayisham Lagoy. So they became a nation there. So it tells us so Jacob and his sons and their grandchildren and servants, the 70, whatever made it up to 70, that was not a nation. That was not the word goy. That was not a nation. That was a family, an extended family. It was in Egypt that they became a family. Now, here's the comment. Milamid shayu Yisrael mitsuyanim sham. That teaches us that there the Israelites were identified as a distinct nation. Okay. why is that important? Because why does Pharaoh enslave the people? In his own words,
He was afraid they were
No,
going
he
to
said they were
rebel.
too powerful.
they were going to become too powerful. So, and if you remember the phrase, Pharaoh says, there's an which is a synonym for goy. There's an that lives within us. Our Our is Egypt. Their is the Israelites. And inevitably, when another distinct people is with us, then they're going to rebel, or they're going to join with our adversaries and fight against us. There's not any choice here. We have to enslave them. We have to oppress them. There's no choice. Seeing the world as a zero-sum game between nations. You've got a majority nation, and you've got a minority nation, and we don't have a choice because they will attack us inevitably. That's how the world works. So Pharaoh is this sort of, well, it's the mean pragmatism, sort of the very narrow pragmatism. Because obviously there's another possibility is, why don't you try to get along? just go and negotiate, talk to, right? But there are people that will say the same thing. So it was in Egypt that they formed a distinct kind of collective, and that made them threatening. I would say it made them threatening, not inevitably, but inevitably to Pharaoh. A guy like Pharaoh, you've got a leader like Pharaoh that automatically divides the world into groups, and saying these groups are always going to compete. And if we've got one nation state where there's another group that's of a different people, then there will always be conflict, and it's going to be either us or them. So there is a logic to Pharaoh. It's just that it's a wicked logic. It's a distorted kind of, well, I don't know if it's distorted. There is a logic there, but one of the lessons of Pharaoh one of the lessons of Pesach is to try to avoid that logic. Don't try to fight the inevitability of Pharaoh's ideology, where all nations in a single place are inevitably going to come into competition and conflict. Because what it implies is that it didn't have to work out that way. There could have been a way of sharing the land, right? I mean, that's or of negotiating, or being. Like for instance, in America, there's the distinctiveness to the Jewish people in America. There are many people that would feel that's a threat. Thank God that's a minority. But there are many people that think the distinctiveness of the Jewish people always constitutes a threat to the majority culture, so you have to do something about them. But thank God in America that hasn't caught on, and that's why we do pretty well here.
Almost did.
Yeah, but we've lived through.
We lived through it. Right?
And also we've lived through it in other places. But it's not just Jews in the rest of the world. I mean, this is true for America. America does have this ethos of this e pluribus unum, that we can take many, and we out of the many becomes one. We can take many nations, put them together, we can live together. And they're experimenting with this in Europe with different degrees of success. There is but Pharaoh would be totally against that. Pharaoh says it's our people, and if we've got a small people living with us, we'll have to enslave them. What are we going to do? Because inevitably they're going to rise, attack us. And for him, there's an inevitability to it. And for us Americans, there's clearly not. I mean, that's exactly what we rebelled against. And but Pharaoh's way is the way that led to the enslavement. Yeah. All that's in that little message. That little message of the people became known as a separate people there. And that's when the trouble began. If they'd stayed a family, or I'll just finish one more thought, then I'll call on you because I forgot that. Of course, the other possibility is that they just would have assimilated and became Egyptians, and which was the choice of a lot of Jews, and it frankly is a choice in America too, and many people are taking that choice. But the original Pharaoh, this is a different Pharaoh now, but the original Pharaoh may have thought, fine, you guys can live here. We'll teach you Egyptian. We'll absorb you. You'll take citizenship lessons, and you'll become Egyptians like the rest of us. And it didn't happen. They remained Jewish, and in remaining Jewish, it created the seeds of the enslavement for a particular political system in Pharaoh. Yeah.
Well, to take Pharaoh aside for a moment,
yeah.
If let's say you took the appeasement approach, we'll just live and let live. We have a God who wants to create a people.
Yeah.
And our people are created by fire. That's how we've been. If you look at our history, we get created when we're oppressed. So I would have to say our God would engineer something oppressive to galvanize the people.
What seemed to happen? It did seem to happen, right? Yeah. Well, you're saying like Pharaoh was kind of a tool of God, and that's definitely hinted at in the story. Yeah. Yeah. One more, and I think we'll have to stop.
There's another historical feature of Egypt that doesn't square with this. Egypt had a northern end and a southern end, And there was competition.
Yeah, there was for sure.
between the
Yeah,
rulers.
right, yeah.
And it wasn't always consolidated into one nation.
Yes, well, that's why I think that so although there's a logic to Pharaoh, there's not an inevitability. There have been successful multinational states where they've actually, and Egypt was one. I mean, there wasn't just one Egyptian people. It was a multinational empire that thrived for a very long time. The Roman Empire is another example of that too. I mean, it thrived for a very long time, and it was made up of many distinct nations. And there wasn't a sense that just because you're a distinct nation, you constitute a threat. There was a possibility. And the United States is an example, the Austro-Hungarian Empire. I mean, there have been other examples. But Pharaoh has this deeply chauvinist idea. There's a sense of history that nations will always compete, but also this chauvinist idea like the Egyptians have to be on top. We are the master race. It's kind of a master race ideology. All right,
it's
stop.
playing out again today in Israel.
Yeah.
One state solution